The Rape of Nanking. On December 13th, 1937, Japanese Imperial Army forces entered the Chinese capital of Nanjing after a brutal 6-week campaign through the surrounding province that had already cost hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. The city's military defender, General Tang Shengji, had promised to fight to the death. Instead, he slipped out of the city before the Japanese arrived, leaving behind roughly 90,000 soldiers and 600,000 civilians with no organized command. What followed over the next 6 weeks is recorded in the diaries of Japanese officers, the testimonies of foreign diplomats who stayed behind the reports of German businessman John Raab, and the findings of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which convened after the war to evaluate the evidence. Soldiers who surrendered or were captured were executed in mass groupings, shot, bayoneted, or buried alive, sometimes in competitions between officers who kept count. Civilians were killed indiscriminately, often in ways designed to maximize suffering rather than achieve any military objective. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women and girls were raped, many of them afterward killed. Buildings were looted and burned. A zone of roughly 2 square miles, established by foreign nationals as a neutral refuge area for civilians, was repeatedly violated by Japanese troops despite its internationally recognized status. The death toll from the Nanking Massacre has been debated by historians for decades. The International Military Tribunal concluded that at least 200,000 civilians were murdered, and Chinese government estimates place the figure above 300,000. Japanese government figures have historically been lower, and the event remains politically contested in Japan in ways that no comparable atrocity in Europe has remained contested in Germany. John Rabe, who used his status as a Nazi party member to negotiate with Japanese officers and sheltered approximately 250,000 Chinese civilians in the neutral zone, wrote in his diary that what he witnessed defied his capacity for language, and that he had seen things he could not describe to his children. He returned to Germany after the war and died in poverty. His diaries were rediscovered in the 1990s and published in English in 1998. They are now considered among the primary historical documents of the Nanking Massacre. Raab himself was arrested by the Gestapo after returning to Germany for writing too candidly about what he had witnessed. He was released after the diaries were confiscated. He never received formal recognition from any government for what he did. Babi Yar. On September 28th, 1941, the German military and SS leadership in newly occupied Kiev made a decision that took 2 days to execute and produced a number that was later reported with bureaucratic precision to headquarters in Berlin, 33,771. That number was the count of Jewish men, women, and children killed at a ravine called Babi Yar on the outskirts of the city on September 29th and 30th. The pretext was a series of explosions in central Kiev set off by Soviet sappers before the German occupation, which German commanders chose to attribute to the Jewish population. On September 28th, notices were posted throughout Kiev in Russian, German, and Ukrainian, ordering the city's Jews to assemble the following morning at a specific street corner near the freight train station with their documents, money valuables, and warm clothing. The language of the notice implied deportation by train. Most of those who read it believed they were being relocated. Approximately 30,000 people arrived at the assembly point on the morning of September the 29th. They were directed through a series of checkpoints, each progressively narrowing the route toward the ravine. At each checkpoint, they were ordered to hand over documents, then valuables, then clothing. When they understood what was happening, they were already inside the cordon of Einsatzgruppen, sea soldiers, and Ukrainian auxiliary police. They were forced to the edge of the ravine and shot. The operation continued for the entire day and resumed the following morning. By the close of September 30th, 33,771 people had been killed, a figure recorded in an official report sent to Berlin as matter-of-factly as a supply inventory. The ravine was used as a killing site for 2 more years until Soviet forces retook Kiev in November 1943. By that time, an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 people had been murdered there in total. Only 29 people are known to have survived the initial 2-day massacre. One of them, Dina Pronicheva, survived by falling into the ravine before being shot and lying motionless under the bodies of the dead until nightfall. She gave testimony at the Nuremberg trials. The Soviet government after the war suppressed specific acknowledgement of Babi Yar as a Jewish massacre, referring to the victims generically as Soviet citizens. The site was nearly destroyed in 1961 when authorities broke a dam holding back waste from a nearby brick factory, sending a flood of mud over the ravine and into the surrounding neighborhoods, killing dozens. A monument acknowledging the Jewish victims as Jewish was not erected until after Ukrainian independence in 1991. When Russian forces struck the Babi Yar area with a missile in March 2022 during the invasion of Ukraine, they destroyed a memorial to the victims and killed 5 people nearby. The site that the Nazi occupation had used as a killing field and that the Soviet government had spent decades refusing to properly acknowledge was struck again 81 years later by another military force moving through the same city. Unit 731. In 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army established a biological and chemical warfare research facility in Pingfang, a district outside the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. It was designated the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, and known internally by its unit number 731. Its actual purpose was human experimentation conducted on a scale and with a methodical cruelty that drew comparisons after the war to the worst of what German physicians had done in concentration camps. Prisoners designated as test subjects referred to internally as maruta, the Japanese word for logs, were subjected to deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid anthrax, and other diseases to study their effects and develop weaponizable strains. Subjects were vivisected alive and without anesthesia to study the progression of infection in organs that had not been contaminated by preservatives. They were placed in pressure chambers to determine at what altitude the human body's organs would rupture. They were frozen alive to study frostbite. They were exposed to chemical agents, flamethrowers, and explosives to measure injury patterns. Women were deliberately infected with syphilis and then examined to track the disease's progression without any treatment being offered. The facility performed these experiments on an estimated 3,000 to 12,000 people over the course of its operation, the wide range reflecting how thoroughly Unit 731's records were destroyed before the Soviet advance in 1945. What made the post-war handling of Unit 731 distinctly different from the Nuremberg prosecutions was the decision by the United States Occupation Authority to grant full immunity to the unit's commanding officer, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, and all of his senior researchers in exchange for the experimental data they had collected. The biological and chemical warfare intelligence was considered too valuable to allow it to disappear into a Soviet prosecution. Ishii died of natural causes in 1959. None of the unit's senior scientists were ever prosecuted. Several went on to distinguished careers in Japanese academia and public health administration. The Japanese government did not formally acknowledge Unit 731's activities until 1997. The 2025 documentary film 731 Biochemical Revelations, released in Chinese cinemas on September 18th of that year, was the most detailed cinematic treatment of the unit's activities yet produced, and became a major box office draw in China, indicating that public awareness of the unit's activities remained substantially lower than historians believed the scale of its crimes warranted. Oradour-sur-Glane. On June 10th, 1944, 4 days after the Allied landings at Normandy had begun the liberation of Western Europe, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, was marching north through France to reinforce the German defensive line. The division had spent 2 years on the Eastern Front, where it had participated in the systematic killing of Soviet partisans and civilians as standard operational doctrine. Its commanders brought that doctrine with them into France. On June 9th, soldiers of Das Reich hanged 99 male inhabitants of the village of Tulle in reprisal for a French resistance attack. The following morning, the 1st Battalion of the 4th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment Der Führer approached the quiet village of Oradour-sur-Glane a farming community 15 kilometers west of Limoges that had no documented history of resistance activity. The official justification, cited afterward by SS Major Adolf Diekmann, who commanded the operation, was a reprisal for the kidnapping of a German officer named Helmut Kempfe. Kempfe had in fact been captured by the resistance and killed near a different village. The people of Oradour-sur-Glane had no connection to his disappearance. The village population that day had been swelled to approximately 650 by refugees from other parts of occupied France, including Jewish families who had relocated there, believing a small rural village offered better safety than a city. The men were separated from the women and children. The men were herded into barns and sheds, shot in the legs to prevent escape, doused with petroleum, and burned alive. The women and children were locked inside the village church, which was then set on fire using an incendiary device placed at the altar. When those inside attempted to break through the windows, they were machine gunned. Soldiers moved through the village, looting property and executing anyone found still moving. In the space of a single afternoon, 642 people were murdered, including 205 children. 6 people survived. One, Marguerite Ruffanche, escaped the burning church by squeezing through a gap near the altar and dropping into a garden outside where she was shot 3 times and lay on the ground until after the soldiers left. She gave testimony at the 1953 Bordeaux trial, at which only 21 of the 200 participating SS soldiers were prosecuted. Most could not be identified or had been killed in action. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane was never rebuilt. By order of the French government, the ruins were preserved exactly as the SS left them, and they remain open to visitors today as a permanent national memorial, the Bataan Death March. On April 9, 1942, American and Filipino forces defending the Bataan Peninsula in the Philippines surrendered to Japanese forces following 3 months of fighting under conditions of severe food shortage and disease. It was the largest surrender of American-led forces in history, approximately 75,000 soldiers, around 12,000 of them. American were now prisoners of the Japanese Imperial Army. Their destination was Camp O'Donnell, a former Filipino military camp that would serve as a prison facility located approximately 65 miles to the north. The march to get them there became one of the most systematically brutal episodes in the Pacific War. Guards beat prisoners with rifle butts and clubs throughout the journey. Men who fell from exhaustion were beaten where they lay, and those who could not get up were shot or bayoneted and left at the roadside. Prisoners were given almost no food or water in tropical heat that pushed temperatures well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Dysentery, malaria, and heat stroke claimed additional lives at a rate the weakened men had no resources to resist. At San Fernando, prisoners were loaded into sealed metal boxcars with no water or ventilation packed so tightly that those who died standing up could not fall. At Capas, they were forced to walk the final miles to the camp on foot. The death toll during the march itself is estimated at between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino soldiers, and between 500 and 650 Americans, depending on the historical source, with additional thousands dying in Camp O'Donnell within weeks of arrival from disease and starvation. General Masaharu Homma, who commanded the Japanese forces, was aware that the march was occurring. His subordinate officers were directly responsible for its conduct. After the war, Homma was convicted of war crimes by a U.S. military tribunal and executed by firing squad in April 1946. What remains striking about the Bataan Death March is how thoroughly it was documented in real time. American survivors kept diaries throughout the march and the imprisonment that followed, and their accounts were compiled into testimony used at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal as among the most detailed primary source records of Japanese military conduct toward prisoners of war. The Holocaust. Beginning in January 1942 at the Wannsee Conference, held in a villa on the outskirts of Berlin, senior Nazi officials formally coordinated the logistics of what they called the final solution to the Jewish question: the systematic murder of every Jewish person in territories under German control or influence. The decision to pursue industrial-scale genocide had been developing since the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, when Einsatzgruppen units had been shooting Jewish communities en masse across Eastern Europe. Wannsee was a logistics meeting convened to ensure that the bureaucratic machinery of the German state, the railways, the civil administration, the camp system, and the security apparatus were fully coordinated for the task. Between 1942 and 1945, 6 extermination camps, all located in occupied Poland, Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec-Chelmno, and Majdanek, operated continuously, receiving transports from across occupied Europe. Auschwitz-Birkenau alone processed approximately 1.1 million people, of whom roughly 90% were killed immediately upon arrival, selected on the platform by SS physicians, who indicated with a gesture whether new arrivals would go directly to the gas chambers or be held for forced labor. Families were separated on the same platform. Children and elderly deemed unable to work were killed within hours of arrival. The scale of what the Holocaust involved logistically was enormous. The coordination of railway timetables across multiple countries, the construction and maintenance of killing facilities, the administration of hundreds of camps and ghettos, the recruitment, training, and management of tens of thousands of guards and administrators, and the systematic theft and cataloging of the property of murdered people, including the hair cut from the dead, the gold teeth extracted from corpses, and the clothing stripped at the gas chamber doors. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 6 million Jewish people were murdered, along with an estimated 5 to 6 million others, including Soviet POWs, Polish civilians, Roma, people with disabilities, and political prisoners. The Nuremberg trials, convened in November 1945, established for the first time in international law the principle that individuals could be held criminally responsible for crimes against humanity committed under state authority, and that the defense of following orders was insufficient justification for participating in genocide. The Nuremberg principles established at those trials form the basis of international criminal law as it exists today, including the statutes of the International Criminal Court. 12 senior Nazi officials were sentenced to death at the main Nuremberg trial. Adolf Eichmann, who had been the principal logistical coordinator of the final solution, evaded capture until 1960, when Israeli intelligence located him living under a false identity in Argentina. He was tried in Jerusalem in 1961, convicted of crimes against humanity, and executed in 1962. He was the last person executed by the State of Israel. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments below.